Good morning.
Good morning.
The blessing of the Lord be upon you.
We bless you in the name of the Lord.
Thank you. And we are studying the intertestamental period of history, getting well down close to the time period of the coming of the Messiah. We are on lesson number 20 today. Right where I want to start, only about three slides that I have, because we're looking at the late Roman Republic. Talked before how that the Roman time period started out as a kingdom. We discussed that last week. And then you have the Roman Republic, and then eventually, at 31 BC, it becomes the Roman Empire. So we are in that late Roman Republic period, and we want to take a look at Lucius, Cornelius, Sulla, Felix this morning. And he lived from 138 to 78 BC. Right? And what I'm thinking is that that's not so much his life as that's when he was a ruler and kind of a dictator for the Roman Republic. And I'll explain that as we go down through here. He is credited with winning the first large-scale civil war in Roman history. Rome, when it was under the kings, they had a dictator in the sense of autocracy. They had kings, but as they started to grow and as they started to move out, they became a republic with the Senate. But the Senate wasn't necessarily like our Senate or our Congress today. If they weren't elected by the people, they were more like the lords of England, the Great Britain. They were high-ranking people and officials from around the what eventually becomes the Roman Empire. They were rich people and famous people. I think you could actually call them a House of Lords. And they were the ones who made the laws, and they were the ones who people looked up to set culture, determine culture, what was important. Of course, they followed along with Greek culture, but kind of evolved that into a Roman culture. They took aspects of that, but their culture was a warlike culture. They looked to expand, and they had famous generals throughout this time period. But the Republic, as it stood, because you had a lot of famous senators, how do you have, and I'm not sure how many they had, but just taking our Senate, how much activity gets done in the Senate of the United States of America when you have 50 people or 100 people trying to make decisions on things? Yeah, it can get to the point where you don't get anything accomplished. You've got people making deals behind the scenes. You vote for this, and I'll help you on that. And it just so what develops then is a consulship. See that under point number 2. In 87 BC, he seized consulship through force. What they did, they developed this idea of consuls. They would have 2, 3 men who the Senate would appoint as consuls. And they would act like the President of the United States. But there'd not be one, there would be 2 or 3. And they would share power. How does that work? It doesn't work too well, does it? And if you get one that's more powerful than the other, or others, now you're back into that situation where you may have a dictator, an autocracy, and especially if you have someone who is a general of a huge army who has a lot of force, a lot of power behind him. And that's Sulla, and that's what we'll call him as we go down through here. So he won the first large-scale civil war in Roman history. Who did he fight against? He fought against the Senate. That was who his war was against. The consulship was kind of, there. He fights against the Senate, and he gets appointed as a consul, or consul, and then in 87 BC, he seizes that position by force and becomes a dictator. He's the first man in the Roman Republic to seize it through force. In other words, and he becomes first consul, first consul to a degree. He's the powerful person. Everybody then has to bow down to him. He's going to make the decisions. Decisions on what? Well, if the Senate passes a legislation that he doesn't like, he can say, nope, we're not having it. And he gets to appoint magistrates. He gets to appoint judges in the courts. He gets to appoint who's in charge of these various little provinces and out here in the areas. There's a lot of power there. Who's he going to appoint? He's going to appoint his friends and people that agree with him. So in 82 or 81 BC, then at that point, the Senate appoints Sulla dictator for the making of laws and for the settling of the Constitution. So they had a Constitution, but their Constitution changed so much. It was like they had a set of laws, but it wasn't standard. Okay. Lately we hear our politicians fighting about our Constitution. Is it a document that is set in law? It's set, it's standard, it can be changed, but it takes a lot to change it? Or is it a living document that however you interpret it is, and each generation can interpret it in a different way. That's where you get into conservative and liberal arguments and such. Well, theirs is like, he doesn't like it, he can just change it. He can move it around, however, and the next guy can do the same thing. Well, you can't have a continuing cultural understanding of how the nation should operate if you're going along on that principle. You understand what I'm saying there? So, when he's appointed as dictator for making laws and for settling the Constitution. In other words, it's no longer the Senate making the laws. He makes the laws, and he settles what the Constitution means. Well, that set the precedent for Julius Caesar's dictatorship at the end of the Republic under Augustus. And we've talked before about Julius Caesar coming and crossing the Rubicon, bringing his army across. Well, see, it's after Sulla does that, and after Sulla dies, there is a consulship of 3 people, the First Triumvirate. We'll talk about that in a minute. But at that point, then, it's, hey, we're making this law. Nobody, none of these generals bring their army past the Rubicon River. If they do, they're traitors. But Sulla had done, that's why they make this law, because Sulla had done that. So he sets the example, and that's what Julius Caesar follows. Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon, brings his army, attacks the Senate, then he gets declared a dictator, and now you're off, starting with the Roman Empire. Not at that time, okay? He doesn't become, Julius Caesar, and we'll talk about him in a moment, he doesn't become a emperor. That's going to occur later with Octavian. But you see how that pattern then is established. Sulla did it, I'll do it. So in 80 BC, Sulla's second consulship with Lucius is established. These consulships were given, and they would last typically 5 years. So here are 3 men, and they're going to be consuls for 5 years. Well, Sulla overcomes the other 2, or 1, or however many's there, and he's a quasi-dictator for these 5 years, and now it's time to appoint another consulship. 2, 3 men to do it, and Metellus, Metellus, Pius, is appointed along with him in this consulship, and he agrees to it. Sulla then resigned his dictatorship. Remember, he was appointed dictator for making laws and for settling the Constitution. So after his 5 years in that first consulship is over, the second consulship with Metellus Pius, or however you pronounce that first part of it, now you've got 2 men in the consulship, and he resigns being dictator. So that gives power back to the Senate, which seems to be good. Hey, he's reforming, trying to get things done. He disbanded his legions to reestablish normal consular government. He dismissed his bodyguards. And in 79 BC, he retired from public life. The reason he did that, he was sick. And he died in 78 BC. But Sulla was essentially the first dictator, but he's in that late Roman Republic period. Any questions on that slide of Sulla? Very important person in Roman history. So the Republic returned to rule under consuls and the Senate from 78 to 60 BC. That's a period of 18, 19 years, right? And the first consul, or set of consulars, Crassus, who lived from 115 to 53 BC, who was the richest man in Rome. That was his popularity. Pompey, and we've talked about Pompey before, he's the conqueror of Asia, right? And we'll deal more with him when we get through with this Roman aspect of it. We'll go back to, well, what did Pompey do in Judea that set up the political structure, geographical structure that led to Herod's, the coming of the Herods, and then eventually the coming of the Messiah. But you see, we're getting down close to that period of time. But that's what he was noted for, the conqueror of Asia. That means he had a big army behind him. And he had some military conquests. And then there's Julius Caesar. We know more about Julius Caesar than the others. He was born July 12, 100, and died 15 March 44 BC. Beware the Ides of March. Heard that phrase? The 15th is the Ides of March. That's when he was assassinated. But he was the conqueror and ruler over Gaul. Now, Pompey was like the ruler over the east. Crassus was just a rich man. So that's the consuls and the Senate that are going to rule, and these are the men who are going to be in charge. All right? Crassus did not have military experience or triumphs to match the other two. Now, Pompey was ineligible for the consulship because he was too young, and he had not held a prior position. In other words, he had not been appointed by the Senate, even though he kind of run the Far East, like the Seleucid area. He hadn't been appointed to a province or run a department in the Roman government. But he was such a powerful figure that he was able to politically worm his way into this. The rules were waived, but Pompey did not take a province under his control as was standard. So as a consulship, he was supposed to be in charge of certain areas. So he said, okay, I'll take charge of those areas, but he never went to those areas to control them. He put them under legates, and he stayed in Rome. That's plain politics, isn't it? Julius Caesar, again, we talked about him, and we'll talk more about him later. But in this time period, the republic stagnated into gridlock as each consul failed to get Senate approval for his programs. So here's Crassus, Pompey, Julius Caesar. They're all, and imagine, they've got these senators. Here's a third for Crassus, a third for Pompey, and a third for Caesar. And nobody can get anything done because nobody can get a majority of the votes. And that lasts for a long period of time. Stagnation. Which leads to the first triumvirate. Triumvirate. Some scholars will say, well, really, that's not the first triumvirate. That they didn't call it that. But if you, most scholars will say this is the first triumvirate. And this is an informal alliance formed around 60 BC. 18 years after they're appointed as the consulship, and it comprises Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. So they're ruling, but now they've come into an agreement. Hey, if we're not working together, we're not getting anything done. But if we work together, we can get things done that each of us want. It's just a matter of playing the politics. What? You wash my back, I'll wash your back. You want something, I'll help you if you help me. Instead of having to deal with 100 people, supposedly, you're just dealing with 3. Well, its aim was to bypass Senate opposition and share power between the 3. Their achievements included land reforms, changes to the tax system, economic restoration, and the establishment of a new legal framework. Aren't those things like we're talking about even today? Doesn't that sound like 2024? Nevertheless, the coalition revealed the need for more stable governance. It was still, you know, they're getting their way, they're getting more accomplished, but they needed something better, a better, and this is something, you know, it's not a democracy, it's a republic. And that, you note the difference. The United States is a democratic republic. We elect our leaders who then make decisions for us. Especially when you talk about legislatively, they didn't. They just had like a House of Lords. The rich and the famous got to make all the decisions. Well, maybe that's kind of what it is today, too. All right? So, Crassus, his son, and his army were slaughtered by the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC. So this is 7 years later. Well, why would Crassus do such a thing? Because Crassus was a rich man, but he didn't have military experience. He didn't have any triumphs like the other 2. So, you know, I need to start a war and win a war so I'll be popular like the other 2. And he goes to fight the Parthians. Now, I talked about the Parthians before, that Rome never really conquers the Parthians. Alexander didn't conquer the Parthians. They just kind of stayed at home and defended the homeland. There they were. They were safe. But he goes there and starts a battle and he gets killed. Now that leaves 2, right? That leaves 2. So Pompey, this led to a conflict then between Pompey and Caesar. Pompey attempted to have the Senate limit Caesar's power by revoking his consulship. But where was Caesar? Caesar was up in Gaul. And that's like France and Germany, and he's got all that area, and he's controlling that. He's the consul, but he's over that area. Well, Pompey is in Rome, and he goes to the Senate, and he says, you know, it's just me and Caesar. Revoke his consulship. That just makes Pompey his consul, right? Which, if there's only one, then what does that make him? That makes him a dictator. Well, Pompey and other senators were concerned about Caesar's growing power and influence. That's why they did it. These efforts failed, and the conflict escalated into Caesar's civil war from 49 to 45 BC. Hey, you think Julius Caesar was just going to sit back and say, it didn't work, you know? No, he says, you shouldn't have done that, you dummy. So what does he do? He brings his army down against Pompey and the Senate. January 49 BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, which was considered a treasonous act by Pompey. But yeah, because they said, and the Senate knew, they made the law. Hey, don't come past the Rubicon. You come, that's treason. That's war. Julius Caesar says, you know what? You tried to get me thrown out of my consulship. You started it. Now I'm going to end this. Battles were fought in Italy, Greece, Egypt, Africa, and Hispania. What's Hispania? Modern day Spain. The decisive battle of Pharsalus occurred in Greece in 48 BC, about a year and a half later. Okay. Pompey was defeated, fled to Egypt, and was subsequently assassinated. Now how many do you have as consuls? Just one, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was made dictator in perpetuity by the Roman Senate on 15 February 44 BC. Dictator in perpetuity? What does that mean? Dictator for life. Because who's going to protect the Senate now? There's no. Now there are forces of Crassus over in the east, and some of Pompey's forces scattered around, and they're still going to fight a little bit, but they're not going to be in Rome to protect the Senate. Julius Caesar's got it. And give you a little hint. One of the persons that Julius Caesar leaves in Italy to keep Italy under control while Julius Caesar's out mopping up some of these other hot spots, is a man by the name of Mark Antony. We'll get to him later. Right? But he's made, but look at the date. 15 February 44 BC. Caesar's assassinated 15 March 44 BC. 1 month later.
That, well, he was just 56 years old. He wasn't very old.
Wasn't very old. And who killed him? Who assassinated him?
People in the Senate.
Members of the Senate. Brutus, Cassius, several others. Shakespeare wrote the play. You know, the famous words, that too, Brutus, you too, Brutus. Brutus, you would do this to me? Why? Why did they do that? They didn't want a dictator. What does it lead to? Well, it leads to a second triumvirate, but then a true dictator. That's all I've got for today. I mean, next week we'll look at the second triumvirate. And that's where Caesar Augustus, Octavian, who becomes Caesar Augustus, comes into power. Caesar Augustus is the emperor when Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And up to, I think it's around AD 15, before Augustus dies and Tiberius becomes emperor. Look how close we're getting to the end of that 400-year period. But when we get through with this Roman period into the Roman Empire, we'll go back and we'll laser focus into what's happening in Judea. All right? And that's interesting. That's the part we really want to get to, but we need to sort this out first. Do you have any questions on this?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the movement of masses of people like the Jews through the wilderness. And even though they had divine resources provided for them, after that, these folks should have known how to quickly move those thousands of soldiers, point A to point B, feed them, water them, keep them healthy enough to fight. One of the things that has always impressed me is, you're talking about they moved from Rome in the first slide across the various provinces down to Egypt. It probably took boats, some of them, but some of them were already up in the Judean area. Just march right down the highway, 1,000 miles, in sandals.
When we get into the end of the Second Triumvirate, as Octavian is taking power, and we know about Octavian and Mark Antony and Cleopatra because of Shakespeare, mainly. We don't pay too much attention to history, but Shakespeare wrote about this, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And when it gets down to it, why did Mark Antony and Cleopatra, why did they get together? They had been together and got divorced, basically, and she had been the lover of Julius Caesar for a while, and all of this. What was going on? Well, it's something you just mentioned. As Mark Antony is fighting against Octavian, Mark Antony gets bottled up in Asia Minor. He can't get out because he doesn't have a navy. Cleopatra has a navy. So he divorces Octavia, Octavian's sister, who had married Mark Antony. He had essentially divorced Cleopatra, married Octavia, hoping that would be a peace treaty. Didn't quite work out. He divorces Octavia. That made Octavian mad. He comes after him more force. He doesn't have a navy that he can fight. He gets Cleopatra, who has a navy. She comes up to help. She gets bottled in. She finally gets out of there, and that's why she has to commit suicide. He commits suicide, Mark Antony, and she commits suicide right after that. Who was we'd say the admiral of Octavian's navy? A man by the name of Agrippa.
Who later becomes a king.
Descendants by intermarriage. Herod Agrippa. Not the Herod Agrippa, but that intermarriage into the Roman dynastic empire. where they get their power. What a play. What a play. We'll stop there.